Welcome back to the Manifesting Health series. I'm Curry Bordelon, your host for this discussion. We're delighted to have Dr. John DeOca join us from the special edition of Mental Health and Wellness, Making Relationships Count. John is a certified family and psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner. John also has extensive experience as a relationship expert, psychiatric nurse practitioner, coach, and educator. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me. I
Excellent.
want-
So as we get started today, let's talk a little bit about how did you get interested in this space? So tell us about yourself and what drove you to the passion of caring for others and making sure their relationships are meaningful.
Yeah, so it wasn't, a steadfast path for me. I went to become a nurse like every other nurse, tried figuring out my path along the way. I thought I was going to be a nurse anesthetist. Then I stepped foot in an ICU and I hated it. Decided I was going to be a nurse injector, which I did. So I worked
Mhm,
in plastic surgery for a little while.
mhm,
Was kind of between doing that and working in the pharmaceutical industry, where it was a very relationship building career for me,
mhm.
um, that really set the path forward. That I was like, what do I want to do here? Because doing injections was not as incredibly fulfilling as I thought. So then I thought, well, what pulled me into this? It was, helping people feel good about themselves, helping people, with their body image,
Right.
any kind of distortions in that realm. And then it was the conversations I would be having with these patients would be surrounded by relationships. So that's kind of set the path forward for me to enter the mental health space. Then I became a coach first before I went back into my psychiatric NP. And the rest is history.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. And it's one of those things that as nurses, we all have our paths, and this is a nice segue into our next discussion, piece of this discussion, to talk about mental health and where we are. And your space sort of built into that relationship building side, and how relationships are incredibly powerful and can be used as such a very therapeutic tool. Where are we today in the relationship building mantra, and how can we help? People around us and others around us get into those more therapeutic and more fulfilling relationships.
I think it's twofold because I think there is, part of us, and I speak to the US when I think about this because I know our culture, right?
Right.
So there's part of us that are really locked in and they're like, I want to improve myself. But then there's part of us where we've become such embedded in the advancements of, whether it's technology and all the perks that come with that, that we've kind of lost ourselves in the relationship space. So, I'll take it in this direction that, we have instant gratification at our fingertips.
And
People are,
it's everywhere.
yes, people can be replaceable when you look at it from that lens. And then it could make us disconnected and less intimate than where we might have been years ago. At the same token, there is an attraction now to mental health that kind of reemerged probably 5 years ago when COVID started. So then there's a pull of people to really look into develop themselves and work on themselves. So that's how I see it as a twofold process.
I'm glad you mentioned the dichotomy that we're constantly battling is those who have been in touch or are in touch with themselves, but we're surrounded with so much white noise and the constant pressure of comparing ourselves to others around, not only within the relationship, but outside of the relationship, to say, oh, here's a perfect vacation with my family on Instagram or whatever social media post or whatever it might be. And then we instantly look at that like, oh, I'm not doing that for my relationship or my family. I'm not as good as a person or of a couple. So how can we transcend that in a way that's meaningful, where people are able to be present in that moment and enjoy it for what it is, and not have to share it with everybody for the sense of validation?
I think there is a spiritual component to relationships. And when I say spiritual, I speak more from an energetic perspective. And I think to be better at relationships, we have to kind of stop depleting our energy into the external world. So stop worrying about what other people's vacations are or what that image of, the family or the relationship looks like, and really come home to self and see what that looks like for you. Because sometimes we're often chasing other people's dreams versus our own. Or sometimes we don't even know what our dreams are. So
That's
if we're
very
able to
true.
connect to ourself more wholeheartedly, then we're able to connect to others a lot better.
I'm glad you mentioned that constant battle to the image of this is where I want to be really versus self-reflection of where what makes me happy versus what makes me happy in a responsive way versus a reflective way. It's difficult for long-term relationships, and people automatically assume a relationship has to be long-term to be successful. How do you, when you talk to your people that you're helping and counseling and coaching, how do you get them to understand that it doesn't have to be a 20 plus year relationship to be successful? It's really about the relationship over time or even in those incremental moments.
Well, you know, I think sometimes even talking about relationships as successful or unsuccessful doesn't necessarily serve us because relationships are always serving us, right? So whether, if it was a relationship that maybe we didn't have a good experience in, it's successful and that it's teaching us what we may want moving forward, or it may teach us to re-examine ourselves. It was funny because I was having a conversation with a friend of mine yesterday about just a couple that didn't make it together. They got engaged and they called off the wedding. And one thing I had said, I said, if they overcame this phase where they were triggering each other through their core wounds, they probably would have been a very satisfied couple.
Hmm.
So sometimes we could lose ourselves, like even in this power struggle, or when we're, getting really caught up in our emotions and we kind of lose sight of what that relationship means to us. And through this fighting, we could deem a relationship as unsuccessful when really it was showing us the mirror to maybe things we weren't ready to see, but that are going to come out eventually.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Can we spend a little bit of time talking about men within the relationship? And this can go as same-sex couples, or it can be in a space of, heterosexual relationships. Can we talk about the man and how they can sometimes get in their own way, if you will, sometimes? And I'll speak for that from past experience as well. Where are we in that understanding, a better understanding of how to support men in really healthy relationships?
Well, I think, going back to how men are socialized, right? Men are socialized to be detached from their emotions. So I think that's something that does a disservice to us. You know, I can't remember where I've read this, but like going back, probably I think it's to the 40s. And this is just speaking platonically, gender and sexual orientation out of it. There was times in the 40s where men held hands as friends. So there was a time period, I guess, as we started becoming more homophobic as a nation and things like that, that men started to detach emotions from their gender. And this, it started, an emotional man became emasculating for a man, for them to, appear manly and so forth. But a lot of times this is not how we're meeting the needs of a relationship. So I'm seeing this improve in younger couples, whatever sexual orientation they are. But sometimes in my older clients, we're still remaining stuck in our ways. And if I was to pull like any kind of mental health statistic, even outside the relationship space, we could see that there's such gaps and disparities amongst men seeking mental health care as a whole, what the depression rates are, what the suicide levels look like, and all,
Mhm.
all things of that nature.
Right. And along with that, not only the social norms and the barriers and the stigmas that we've created on ourselves as a group, as a society, as a culture, and now we're thrown into the constant turmoil of change. There's always something different, new, COVID. I mean, there's constant bombardment of challenges to our sense of stability. So, how do you advise your clients, and how do you advise your patients and colleagues and people around you to stay calm and keep the course? Meaning, we want to react to this, and that's part of the intent is to get responses, whether it be news feeds or media or social media or constant bombardment of information. How do you advise your people around you to say, let's take a deep breath, remain calm, and stay focused?
Yeah, I think there's always relaxation techniques, right? But as much as we could implement some of those techniques, sometimes it's a perspective shift of, as much as change is constant, everything's going to change at some point or another. We are constant as well. So knowing and having the confidence that, like I said before, you could always come back home to self. You can't abandon yourself. You can't leave yourself. So you have yourself to get you through and navigate these situations. So in addition to some of these techniques to make us feel better, it's almost building that self-efficacy and self-confidence that you can navigate these changes. And it could be by simple things of, if it's the media that's triggering us, learning how to filter that out. Or if it's just us building our own confidence in different ways of, you know, I'm a lot more in control of things than I think they are. And that doesn't look like me controlling other people or circumstances, but I always have choice.
Right. Well, thank you, and I really appreciate all that you've shared with us today, and I thank you for your wisdom and your expertise. In our last 30 seconds to a minute that we have with each other, what's your big takeaway for anyone who's listening?
I think my biggest takeaway is let's learn to revalue, if we haven't already, human interaction and human experience. A lot of my work's based on relationships, so that's what I would want to reinstill into anyone listening. So, especially in this political climate that we're
Hmm.
in, we're all humans. Let's see ourselves as humans. We could have differences, we could disagree. Let's rehumanize one another because anyone's capable of doing bad things, anyone's capable of doing good things. We all have it within us. So no one's worse than the other.
Thank you, and I appreciate that very powerful message. So thank you again, and thank you all for listening, and we look forward to seeing you next time.